OCAAT, Chapter 1. Sunday evening, done with dinner with an old high school friend, found Sydney King en route to see another one. She'd given thought to calling first, and she would have, except all she had was an address given her by Mavis 4 months ago. She didn't ask how Mavis knew where to find him, had just accepted it and sent him an invitation to her college graduation. She was perfectly okay receiving her diploma in the mail, but that, of course, was not acceptable to Mavis. 5+ years, Sydney King, and you are going to march across that stage, and I'm going to be there to watch you, she'd said. There was no way she could say no to that, and truth be told, she was glad she hadn't. What a rush walking across that stage had been, and the sense of pride at finishing something she dreamed of for so long. She was done, the recipient of 2 degrees, art and engineering. Yay her! He didn't show. Not that she thought he would. Really, he'd done more than enough. Way more than she could ever repay, which was the reason she was here today, to personally thank him for his support. It was the least she could do. She pulled into the driveway of his home. It was a new house, expensive and modern, some architect's concoction of stone and wood, and the roof looked to be made of copper. It seemed smaller than the one he'd grown up in, she thought, disappointed. Talk about coveting a house. She so did, had coveted him and the home he'd lived in most of her life. So many memories of being tutored in the kitchen by him, the kid sister of his boy's girlfriend. So many of her fantasies were with her married to him. She could laugh at that now and cringe at her younger self sneaking into bed with him that one time in her need to make him hers. A colossal mistake of epic proportions. And all behind her now, she thought. She hoped. She picked up the gift she'd purchased for him and made her way up the sidewalk, careful not to trip over her feet as she maneuvered around the large slabs of stone that were placed on top of each other to form a walkway. She hoped he was home. She dressed well today. Unlike her childhood self's love of jeans and t-shirts, the adult Sydney preferred dresses that showcased her figure and her hair, free and full. With it falling softly around on her head, bouncing with the force of her steps, she could make quite the impression. Had made quite the impression on a bunch of young men in college. She was sure of her ability to attract the male gaze. She rang the doorbell. "Graham Garrison," she said when it opened. Dang, she thought at seeing him. It had been 8 years. Was life always going to be good for him? Relaxed in athletic shorts and a faded Rice University t-shirt, he was the same handsome dude from her youth. Dark, thick hair and brown-eyed tallness. Good thing she had dropped her crush, or she'd have a problem on her hands, as G had changed too. Of course, it was only in a good way. His muscles had thickened, filling out the slim boyhood body her young girl had grown up admiring. "Sydney King," he said, his smile wide as he looked her over. "Surprise," she said, smiling. "Mavis gave me your address for the graduation invitation. Nice neighborhood, by the way." "Thanks. No worries. Come in," he said, opening the door wider. "Sure," she said, her gaze darting between him and the interior of his home as she entered. Dark wood flooring, walls covered in pretty coral-colored paint, and skylights to highlight it all. Her view was limited to the foyer, but yeah, it was nice in here. Gorgeous and male was both the man and his inside living space. He closed the door behind her, gave her the once-over from head to toe, which for some reason he didn't try to hide. "So, I bet you're wondering why I'm here," she asked, a little disconcerted from him checking her out. And was that desire she thought she saw in his gaze? "To say hello," he said. "Yes," she said, chuckling. "That, and I wanted to thank you." She took a deep breath and charged into her prepared speech as she handed him her gift. "This as a small token of my appreciation for all you've done for me, starting with your high school tutorship, encouraging me to finish high school and college, and if that wasn't enough, for funding my education. I couldn't have done it without you. You were right, it was what I needed to do." And done with the speech, she leaned in and placed a kiss on his cheek. "You're welcome. I knew your dreams, remember," he said, she could tell he meant it, that he was proud of her. "I do," she said, smiling, "which was why, again, I wanted to thank you personally." "You're welcome again, and congratulations for finishing what you started," he said, smiling, shaking his head, before he tore into her gift, letting the wrapping fall to the floor. He smiled as he stared at a picture of her, dressed in her cap and gown, one hand outstretched toward the dean, accepting her diploma. "Thank you," he added. "You're welcome," she said, watching him smile at her picture, pleased with the look of pleasure on his face as he did so. He really wanted the best for her, which she'd known, but wow, at having him in her corner, always, she thought. "It's perfect," he said. He opened his arms and pulled her in for a hug. "Your first kid through college, huh?" she said into his neck, arms around his waist. She could feel the old familiar pull that she'd always felt around him. "Something like that," he said, chuckling, releasing her. "Well, without your financial support, it would not have been possible." "It would have. You'd done what you needed to do. You always have, starting with waiting in the hall to ask me to tutor you, riding the bus to my home to be tutored, ignoring the naysayers like your Aunt Crystal." "A number one naysayer," she said, her smile rueful. "You always find a way. You always have." "Maybe. Anyway, thanks," she said, bending over to pick up the wrapping paper from the floor. It needed picking up, and she needed a place to hide her pleased reaction to his words. "So, you're home for good?" he asked, watching her bent form as she made short work of picking up the wrapping paper. She looked perfect in her dress, bold pink in color and trimmed in white, simple, and a compliment to the smooth brown of her skin and her figure. It hugged the curves of her plump breasts, just enough hips, and the right amount of ass that had caught up with her legs. No more braids. Instead, her hair was thick and natural, forming a halo around her head. Wow, someone had really grown up, he thought. "Who knows," she said, standing upright again, meeting his gaze. "For now, I have a job. I'll be working for OCAAT, the assistant to Mavis," she said, chin up and bracing for his reaction of displeasure. Not that it would change anything. Her life decisions were her own from now on. "OCAAT, huh?" he said. His expression she couldn't read. "Yes," she said, all challenge against the disapproval she had expected from him. "They do important work. You know this. It's the same from when we volunteered, except OCAAT is not this remarkable organization that does so much for our kids." "Yep," he said, half hearing her, wrestling with all the ways in which she'd changed physically. His mind was trapped in how good she looked. "Sydney, all grown up," he added. "What?" she said, meeting his gaze, surprised at the lack of disapproval in them. Instead, was that interest? What? No way, and not likely. "What?" he asked. "Are you listening to me?" "Of course. You are going to work for OCAAT. I understand. It's a good choice." "Okay," she said, giving him some side eye. "I was all prepared for, 'What the hell, Sid?'" she said in her best imitation of a male voice. "I expected all kinds of responses to my job choice, but not that one. Well, it's your life. And OCAAT is a great organization. It's changing the world one child at a time." "Yes, it is," she said, pleased and still surprised. "Any word from your sister?" he asked. No," she said, surprised again. She rarely thought of her sister, or she tried not to think of Shelby King. Some days it was harder than others. "How's Crystal and Nico? Are they still living in Austin?" "No, they moved back to Hillsborough. I kept in touch, saw them during spring breaks and holidays." "Nico's the same Nico," she said, smiling. "I bet," he said, smiling too. The doorbell rang, interrupting whatever he was about to say next. "Expecting someone?" she asked. "Yep," he said, with either a grin or a grimace. She couldn't tell which, as he opened the door. "Hey," he said to a woman. She had the same look as Astor, his girlfriend in high school. Dark-haired, tall, and super thin, this woman had the same aesthetic that all of Graham's other girlfriends had. "Heather, this is Sydney, a good friend of mine from high school," he said. "Hi, nice to meet you," Heather said, swinging her hair out of her face as she moved inside. She smiled, studying Sydney for signs of encroachment. "Hi," Sydney said, moving her gaze quickly back to G. "I'm out. I didn't plan to stay any longer than it took to drop that off," she said, pointing to the picture in his hand. "Thank you again." "You're welcome again. See you around," he said, watching as she moved past Heather and outside. She smiled one last time before she turned away. "Hey," he said, planting a kiss squarely on Heather's lips, watching Sid walk to her car. "Sydney is?" Heather asked. "Friend from high school that I used to tutor. She finished college this year. She stopped by to drop this off," he said, lifting up the picture. He closed the door and placed it on the floor to lean against the wall. "Helping the underprivileged? No, not at all," he said, slightly irritated by her words. "We attended the same high school." It had never been that, he thought. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said, watching him. "I'm not offended," he said, smiling. But yeah, he was. Didn't matter, as he and Heather weren't that couple. "What high school?" "The Hills." "That's a good school, I hear, in a good neighborhood, too. A great place to raise kids." "It was. It is," he said, smiling at the memory of his old student, friend, now a grown woman. He'd kept himself out of her life intentionally, to grow up and figure out her life for herself. She must have silently agreed, as she hadn't returned to Austin much. Heading off to this city or that with friends, working at OCAAT, and taking summer classes somewhere had kept her away. None of which he would have known were it not for Mavis, who had, without any prompting, kept him informed of the major and minor events in Sydney's life. He'd taken pleasure in seeing her forward progress, too. It had been 8 years since he'd last seen her in person, crying in his arms at his apartment in Houston. A young woman on the verge of adulthood. That memory was a far cry from the Sydney he encountered today, filled out, confident, and finally home to find her nephew. The unsaid reason, and the true reason she was signing on to OCAAT, of course, she'd grown up for sure, but he'd bet in this way, focused on her task, a goal, she was the same Sydney as she always been. "Hey, where'd you go?" Heather said, her expression cautious as she gazed back at him. "What? Nowhere. I'm here with you." "Doesn't feel like it," she said. "My apologies then," he said, pulling her close, as he pushed his thoughts of Sydney to the back of his mind to contemplate later. Tonight, it was here and now, with Heather.